This is a story about a painter and about a woman who spent 20 years fighting the sexualization of her work and who eventually resolved that fight not by arguing, but by leaving. More precisely, I want to speak about the importance of the 24 works she painted in a desert landscape. She had already been very famous for 20 years, but she chose, at the height of that fame, to go somewhere where she could look deeper. It is also an essay about what happens to the market when an institution decides to take a body of work seriously in a new part of the world. The institution is the Courtauld Gallery in London. The show is called Georgia O'Keeffe Ghost Ranch. It opens in October 2027. And I want to talk about it now, before it becomes buzz of the town and because any signs of trendiness. My name is Zanne van Wolff. I'm an art advisor, and this is what I do. I pay attention, and I do it early. But before we take you to the market, I want to take you somewhere. In January 2025, I drove through this landscape. I was not especially seeking out O'Keeffe, but what happened made me see her work differently after this trip, not only intellectually, but physically in the body and soul. This is White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico. It is the world's largest gypsum dune field. The sand is white, not cream, not beige, white, and the light that comes off is unlike anything I have encountered in Europe or anywhere else. O'Keeffe's ranch is further north, but I imagine she experienced something similar, an emotion very difficult to describe without sounding either mystical or sentimental. Standing in that landscape, I understood something about the human impulse to call a place sacred. The Pueblo peoples have inhabited this land for centuries, the Navajo, the Apache. They have always shown what this place is, not simply terrain, an experience that develops a kind of faith we sense arriving in a great large landscape. When the land is that large and you are that small, something shifts in your understanding of what is possible, of what is given, of what you are standing inside of. O'Keeffe described it herself. In a documentary made for her 90th birthday, she said, "When I go to New Mexico, that was mine. As soon as I saw it, that was my country. I had never seen anything like it before, but it fitted to me exactly. It's something that's in the air. It's just different. The sky is different. The stars are different. The wind is just different." That is not a romantic description. That is a precise one. The sky, the stars, the wind, specific things. Things that can only be said by someone who has actually stood in it. I stood in it in January 2025, and I knew exactly at that point what she meant. Let's look at the context. Georgia O'Keeffe was born in 1887 on a dairy farm in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, which is more north. Her parents farmed over 600 acres. She was the second of 7 children. Sun Prairie was flat, almost aggressively flat. The land around it is part of a great glacially flattened interior of the continent. Wide open fields, low horizons, a sky that sits directly on top of you because there's nothing tall enough to interrupt it. It is not a dramatic landscape. It's a landscape that teaches you about light, about the quality of air, about the relationship between a flat earth and an enormous sky. She walked to the local one-room schoolhouse each day observing nature, and she was drawing seriously by the time she was a child. Her family background was unusual. Her mother's father was a Hungarian count who had emigrated after the failed revolution of 1848. Her father was the first-generation Irish-American. 600 flat Wisconsin acres, and underneath them, Europe, displacement, ambition. That was her childhood. After that came Chicago, the Art Institute, technical drawing with William Merritt Chase, emphasis on realism, weight in the European tradition. Then New York, the Art Students League, the most advanced training available in America at that time, and still something was missing. The training she received was about reproducing what already existed, about mastery of an inherited visual language. She was good at it. That was the problem. She could see exactly where it ended. She stepped away entirely, took commercial work, drawing lace and embroidery for advertisements in Chicago, and then quietly found her way back to teaching at a small women's college called Columbia College in South Carolina. She was 27 years old, teaching drawing to students who had no particular artistic ambition, in a landscape that offered her nothing visually that she hadn't seen in the softer form. Pine forests, river floodplains, the quiet heart of the Midlands. And then something happened. She laid out everything she had ever made, everything she had been taught, and asked herself, what in all of this is actually mine? What have I genuinely seen and felt? What was not come from someone else's instruction or someone else's specific expectation? And the answer was almost nothing. So she put it all aside and started again with charcoal, the most basic instrument available, and she began making marks that came entirely from what she called the unknown, from the interior rhythms, from sensation, from forms she found in nature but translated into something no one had ever seen before. Rising curves like flames or rivers, jagged vertical lines, rounded forms pressing against each other, not representations of the South Carolina landscape, but made in the silence of it, in the enclosure of it, in the accidental solitude the posting had provided. She sent a group of them to her friend Anita Politzer in December 1915 with strict instructions to not show it to anyone. And of course, Politzer took them to Alfred Stieglitz on New Year's Day in 1916. Stieglitz's response was immediate. These are the purest, finest, sincerest things I have entered 291, which is the gallery, in a long while. The landscape that produced these drawings was not dramatic, but it gave her something New York and Chicago had not, enough silence to hear herself think. The desert would come later, but the question was in time. What is genuinely mine? Stieglitz was a photographer, and his gallery 291 was the center of the American modernist world in the 1910s. The first gallery in the United States to show Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, Rodin, the full weight of what was happening in Europe, surrounded by a circle of American artists trying to understand what modernism could mean on this side of the Atlantic. Marsden Hartley, Arthur Dove, John Myron, Charles Demuth, Paul Strand. O'Keeffe entered that world through her drawings. She came to New York furious. She had given Politzer explicit instructions. She left in a correspondence with Stieglitz that would reshape her life. She was then married but divorced and eventually married O'Keeffe in 1924, 23 years her senior. He photographed her obsessively, hundreds of portraits, many of them intimate, and those photographs, widely seen and widely reproduced, established a particular public image of O'Keeffe as a creature of sensuality, of femininity, of the body. The male critics of the period were eager to confirm that image. They wrote about her flowers in Freudian terms. They wrote about her as the natural expression of womanhood. They eroticized her in her work, and she rejected every word of it for the entirety of her life. The flowers, black iris, Jimson weed, oriental poppies, were all made in New York in the 1920s. She was inspired by photography and the close-up, which was then a new and radical way of seeing. Her paintings were close-ups, radically large, forcing you to see a single flower as an entire world. She made them large so that people had no choice but to see them. She was not naive about the art world and how it worked, and she was not to stay in it, not on those terms. In 1929, at the age of 41, O'Keeffe accepted an invitation from the arts patron Mabel Dodge Luan to spend the summer in Taos, New Mexico. She arrived and she said, "As soon as I saw it, it was my country." She had spent 20 years in New York, famous, married to the most powerful art dealer in America. She had a studio, a collector base, an established identity. She looked at the high desert and recognized something she had not found anywhere else. Not in Wisconsin's flat fields, not in New York's urban canyons, not in South Carolina's pine dark enclosure. Something that fitted to her exactly. She came back every summer after that, and I want to say clearly, she was not a hermit. Ghost Ranch was full of life. Writers, artists, friends passed through constantly. She cooked, she hiked. She was a vivid and demanding presence. But she was free in a way she had never been free in New York, free to set the terms. In 1934, she visited Ghost Ranch for the first time north of Santa Fe, a ranch named by Arthur Pack. She planned to stay there one night, and accidental circumstances kept her for the entire summer. In 1940, the same year she painted Red and Yellow Cliffs, the work I want to examine carefully in a moment. She bought a house at Ghost Ranch. In 1949, 3 years after Stieglitz died, she moved to New Mexico permanently. She never returned to live in New York. Ghost Ranch sits at around 6,500 feet. The land behind the house rises to a wall of cliffs, red and yellow and ochre. Striations of iron oxide and ancient sediment climbing 700 feet from the valley floor. 12 miles to the southwest, a flat-topped mountain called Pedernal sits on the horizon. just to let you know that this is not a mountain, but a very similar one. This one is in Arizona. There are two subjects that will absorb her life for the rest of her working life. She painted those cliffs 7 times. She painted Pedernal nearly 30 times in oil and pastel as the sole subject, as background to bones and skulls, as a silhouette in full color, predominantly across the span of 22 years, from 1936 to 1958. Not every day, not compulsively, but as a sustained meditation, she returned to it year after year. The title shifted over time, from Deer Skull with Pedernal to Red Hills with Pedernal, or eventually just Pedernal, as though she were narrowing her attention until only the mountain remained. She called it my mountain. She said, "It's my private mountain. It belongs to me. God told me if I painted it enough, I could have it." And I want to sit with that statement for a moment. She's saying the way to possess something is to look at it until you understand it. Not to own it at any legal sense, to make it yours through the act of sustained serious attention. That is also a description of what a serious collector does. The difference between buying art and collecting it is exactly this, the willingness to look until you understand what you are looking at. I want to talk about one painting specifically, because this one is one of the works, one of the 24 works that's going to the courtyard. And because I think it's one of the most important landscape paintings of the 20th century. And I want to explain why I believe that. Red and Yellow Cliffs. Oil on canvas, 1940, 24 by 36 inches, so 61 by 91 centimeters. It is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And what does it show? The cliffs. That is almost all it shows. The canvas is dominated almost entirely by rock face. The geological strata run horizontally across the picture plane. Bands of the deep red, burnt orange, yellow ochre, pale cream. And the bands are not flat. They curve, they swell, they press forward. The cliffs do not recede into conventional depth. They advance. There's a thin strip of the blue sky at the very top left corner. That is the only sky. The rest of the canvas is cliff. There are small green shrubs dotted across the rock face, the only organic life dwarfed entirely by the geology. The Metropolitan Museum notes that the smallest of that patch of the sky is precisely the point. It emphasizes the immensity of the geological forms. The sky is not the subject. The earth is the subject. The sky is what is left over. Now let's look at what O'Keeffe is doing technically. Conservation analysis shows that she applied paint using continuous curvilinear brushstrokes at a low angle to the canvas, creating a raised ridge at the edge of each form. The surrounding brushwork runs parallel to those edges. Everything moves together. Everything follows the form. The result is that the cliffs feel geographically accurate, as if laid down by time, stratum by stratum, exactly as they were in reality. The formal method and the subject are the same thing. This is not painting cliffs. This is painting the way cliffs are made. And the color. These are not romanticized colors. The red is iron oxide, exactly that red. The yellow and cream in the upper strata are caliche and gypsum. Gypsum is the same material that I spoke about in the white sands. Those are exactly those yellows. She's not interpreting the landscape. She's insisting on it. And then there's the cropping. She could have shown you the full valley. She could have given you the sky and distance and the picturesque composition that landscape painting has been producing for 300 years. She chose instead to fill the frame with rock, to deny you the distance, to force you to be inside the cliff rather than in front of it. Polo magazine described the painting as muscular, and that word is right. It is not gentle. It does not invite you to admire it from safe distance. It requires you to be present with it. That decision to crop away the picturesque, to refuse the view in favor of the substance, is one of the most radical things in 20th century American painting. Made in the summer of 1940 in the desert north of Santa Fe by a woman who had been told for 20 years that what she made was interesting because of what it said about being a woman. She was not painting womanhood. She was painting a rock. Red and Yellow Cliffs is one painting from one summer, but Ghost Ranch produced an entire world. She painted a specific wall of 7 rocks 7 times, each one different light, in different framing, in weight of the color. The 1940 version, going to the courtyard, is the most frontal, the most uncompromising. There are others that we have seen already where she allows slightly more sky, slightly more distance, but she always returns to the same wall, the same geology, still trying to find what she has not said. Pedernal, the flat-topped mountain 12 miles away. She painted it from the front, from the side, through the hollow of a horse skull, through a window, at dawn, at dusk, as a silhouette in full color, the skull paintings, pelvis with the moons, pelvis with distance. The pelvis series are among the most formally inventive things she made. She found that looking at the landscape through the hollow of a bone changed what you saw. The bone became a frame, a lens, a meditation on the time that was never sentimental, but always precise. The Black Place, about 150 miles west of Ghost Ranch, she discovered a stretch of gray hills, volcanic, almost lunar. That she called simply the Black Place. She painted it in a series of works that are among the most austere things in American art. No color to speak of, gray and darker gray, and the sharp ridge line against sky. These paintings read almost as pure abstraction, but she insisted, I am painting exactly what I see. And the bones, she collected them from the desert floor and brought them back to the studio, not as some symbol of death, as objects of extreme formal interest. She wrote, the bones are very white against the blue that will always be there after we are not. There's nothing theatrical in that sentence. She's describing a color relationship. She's also describing exactly what she understood about time. All the cliffs, the mountain, the black hills, the bones, the pelvis paintings, the skulls against the sky, constitutes a body of work made over nearly 50 years, in a place she chose entirely on her own terms. No gallery, no critics at dinner, no Stieglitz deciding what was important and what was not, just a desert and 40 years of looking. In October 2027, the Courtauld Gallery in London will open Georgia O'Keeffe Ghost Ranch. Nearly 24 works focused on exactly this chapter, the New Mexico years, the specific landscape, the specific body of work, including red and yellow cliffs, painted in 1940. The Courtauld does not do blockbusters. It is a relatively small museum, one of the finest collections of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist work in the world, housed in Somerset House, attended by people who go specifically to look carefully. When it mounts a focused show, it is making a scholarly argument. It is saying this chapter has not been fully understood. This work requires your sustained attention. The senior curator has said plainly that O'Keeffe's relationship with Ghost Ranch remains under-recognized in Britain. That is an institutional admission with market consequences. Consider that Tate Modern Retrospective did in 2016, the largest O'Keeffe show ever staged outside of the United States, the first significant UK exhibition of her work in more than 20 years. Before that show, there were no O'Keeffe works in UK public collections. The show was a deliberate reintroduction to a European audience, and in the years that followed, the secondary market response was measurable. New buyers entered, the conservation broadened, prices tightened. The Courtauld show will do something more targeted. It will focus European attention specifically on the desert work, the cliffs, the bones, the Ghost Ranch canvases, rather than the flowers most European audiences associate with her name. It will make the argument forcefully that the New Mexico body work is where the deepest thinking happened. That argument, coming from the Courtauld, lands with exactly the collectors and institutions in Europe who matter for secondary market pricing. So I want to come back to where we started. January 2025, my family and I drove through this landscape. We stopped in at White Sands, and it was an amazing experience. That will exist long after we leave. The Pueblo people knew this. They have built a relationship with this land across centuries that does not require the land to platform for them, to be scenic, to be legible in European terms. They understand it as something they live inside of, not something they consume. That is what O'Keeffe was learning at Ghost Ranch. Not how to represent the desert, how to live inside it, and to paint from that position. She painted those cliffs 7 times. She painted that mountain, and she could no longer see it clearly. When she almost lost her central vision in the early 70s, she kept working in clay, and then in paint again as her sight partially stabilized. She was still making work in her mid-90s, She died in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1986 at the age of 98. The entirety of Ghost Ranch's body of work was made on terms she chose in a place she found by accident and then refused to leave. When the courtyard opens the show in October 2027, I will be there. And I will be thinking about what it means to build a practice or a collection that does not require anyone else's permission. This is what Georgia O'Keeffe actually collected. Not landscape, not bones, time on her own terms.